Welcome back, comic fans, to the Donovan Bandits. How are you all doing today? We have the man behind the wonderful website known as the 13th Dimension. We're talking to Dan Greenfield. Dan is one of the best when it comes to putting stories and information out there for us fans to really kind of mull over, start conversations, start debates with. 13th Dimension, if you haven't checked it out, what a phenomenal site. Big names like to write for it as well. And Dan is just an awesome, awesome guy. You could tell that, comics is his passion. And he's a local guy too. He's just down the road from us here in New York. So we're so happy to know that as well. So without any further ado, Dan Greenfield. Mr. Dan Greenfield. Dan, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me. I really, this is a pleasure. Thanks.
So let's start at the beginning. How do you first discover comic books?
Like a lot of guys or a lot of people, I should say, of my generation, the 1966 Batman TV show. My friend John S. Drew,
Mhm.
who's also a podcaster, would refer to us, excuse me, as first generation syndication babies. So, I was born in the late 60s. So by the time by the time the show was in syndication is when I can't even say I discovered it because in my mind it was always there.
Right.
And it's just always been there. So, it's not like I remember the first time someone sat me down in front of the TV and it was on. It's always been there. So from there, you're talking the early 70s, it naturally grew
Mhm.
from the TV show to comics to Mego to cartoons and on and on and on.
Mhm.
With the exception of a hiatus in the '90s, pretty much for the rest of my life.
Makes sense. Now, what was it about Batman that, reached you so well?
Well, from the TV show, it was obviously. I mean, it's. I mean, as we know as adults, it
Mhm.
works on so many levels, and I still watch it, and I find it incredibly funny. It's
Mhm.
such a great show, so well written, very clever. Um, but when I'm a 5-year-old kid, it's just bright and exciting. All of it. The villains are great. The biff bam boom. The fact, it didn't matter that it was a formula. In fact, the formula was part of its charm. Was, you knew Batman and Robin were gonna, have a fight, and then they were gonna get into a trap, and the traps were great, and you had the cliffhanger because you watched it on for me, it was Channel 11 in New York, and so
Mhm.
you'd have it every day, for when it would come, because it would come and go. But like maybe around 4:30, it would be on television, and then it was on for a half hour, and then you watch the next one the next day, and on and on and on. So it was that colorful sense of excitement, and it was very basic. It was good guys were good, bad guys were bad. It
Mhm.
was very colorful. The stakes were high only in the sense that it was good guys versus. It was basically colorful cops and robbers, but nobody got killed. There was no, and you always knew that Batman and Robin were going to get out of the trap. I mean,
Mhm.
you never even as a little kid, never doubted that for a second.
Right.
But the question was, how were they going to get out of it? And that was the fun part.
So, as a fan, how did you then decide I like to do some writing about comics and, the history of it and stuff like that?
Well, that's kind of a funny one because I had after what I refer to as I like to refer to as the Great Hiatus, which
Mhm.
started around 92, 93. Basically, if I could just take a step back,
Sure.
I discovered comics, within a year or two of having, the show's having its impact on me.
Mhm.
And I remember the earliest comics that I saw on the spinner rack, and one of them was Batman number 237, which was the Denny O'Neil, Neil Adams story,
Mhm.
the Night of the Reaper, the Halloween issue. And I remember at the time what struck me about it was, and I was little, the book came out in 1971, which would have made me 4. I don't know if it had been on the stands for a few months or whatever, but I remember looking up at it at a spinner rack at a Krauser's in New Jersey.
Mhm.
And for those of you who are out of the area, Krauser's is basically like your 7-Eleven. And I just remember being transfixed because this was not the Batman I knew. It was Batman and Robin and this really, really scary Grim Reaper, which I didn't even know that's what it was called at the time, but it
Mhm.
was dangerous. So from there it started to blossom, and I never really thought about writing about anything related to it. I mean, if anything, as a kid growing up, I thought, maybe I want to make comic books. Maybe I want to write my own stories or draw. I used to draw my own comics and create my own characters and all that kind of stuff that typically, fans would do. Um, when I was in high school, I grew up in New Jersey. I took weekend courses at the Joe Kubert School. And because I wanted to try my hand at being an artist, I never really thought about writing the stories
Mhm.
as much as I like the idea of drawing them. And then I found out very quickly that I had neither the talent nor the drive to get any better than I was. And so I didn't last very, this was just like a weekend class. It wasn't
Yeah.
like, I was, so I just kind of followed along with it and consumed not just everything, specifically related to Batman, but but other comics, and consumed, and when I say consume, I mean really consume.
Mhm.
It wasn't just buying comics; it was everything, particularly Batman. And then in the late '80s, you had the second Batmania into the
Mhm.
'90s, and really what had happened by that time is that I just hit a burnout period.
Mhm.
And that would have been the early '90s and around '93. So you're talking anywhere between roughly about 10 years later or there. So after my son was born,
Mhm.
I started feeling that itch again. Like I had not missed comics until I started missing them.
Right.
And I had quit cold turkey just because I just was like, I was overwhelmed. And what was in, I like, but when you have a kid, you have a son, and it's all of a sudden, well, it'd be fun to do this stuff with him. It'd be fun. People give gifts, they give little Batman onesies and
Mhm.
whatever. And so, you really start feeling the itch, and not to be disrespectful, but like an addict, I started haunting the local comic book shop again, not buying anything,
Mhm.
but just going in and looking around and seeing what was going on. And oh, DC Direct has these action figures that are so much more realistic than Migos. And oh, what's going on with Batman? What is this all about? So, and then the next thing you know, of course, I'm starting to pick up a couple of issues here and there. And a friend of mine had turned me on to a couple of blogs that were active at the time. I don't think they're really active anymore, but there were some message boards. This would have been the early 2000s, 2000, 2005, somewhere in there. And there were message boards and there were blogs, with my wife's help, I discovered podcasts
Mhm.
that were, doing comics. And through all of this, I started to feel the urge to really write about this
Mhm.
stuff. And I can't say where it came from, but I was like active on there was a Batman message board, for example, that I was very active on. So it just came out of me. I mean, is a, in my career, I am, I'm in media. So like
Mhm.
the idea of writing has been with me really since childhood.
Right.
It's funny, never really for fiction, but really for nonfiction.
Mhm.
And there was this book by a guy named Jim Beard about the 1966 Batman show, and
Mhm.
I read that in a flight, like one flight. I read that like back and forth the return flight, reading it, and all these, and I started to think, I could do this. I think I can do this. I don't know how to do it, but I
Mhm.
think I can. And so in 2013, I hooked up with a guy and we did a blog, a
Mhm.
very basic blog, and I was writing about comics. You won't find any trace of it online anymore, but it was called Parallel Worlds,
Oh, yeah.
and I was doing comics, he was doing video games, and it imploded like within 3 months. Not for any kind of just circumstances,
Mhm.
but I wasn't done. Now I had the fever. And I contacted a friend of mine, a guy named Cliff Galbraith, who was he was the co-creator of something called the Asbury Park Comic Con.
Mhm.
And my family had been from Asbury, and so I was like, "This is crazy, Asbury Park having its own Comic Con." I mean, now every town has a Comic
Right.
Con, but this was still sort of when smaller shows were starting to pop up on the regular. And I contacted him and I said, "Have you ever thought about doing a website?" And the funny thing was, it was like a Wednesday because I was in Manhattan and I was right outside of Midtown Comics and I'm standing at Lexington and 45th on my phone and I'm calling him. I said, "Do you want to do like a website?" He goes, "I've wanted to do a website for it." I said, "All right, we'll do a website." And neither of us had any idea what we were doing. whatsoever. There was no plan. There were no resources. The only basic idea was that we figured we would take over the world by using this forum to, give me an opportunity to write, but also to promote his shows.
Mhm.
Ultimately, his big show became East Coast Comic Con, which was in East Rutherford, New Jersey. Unfortunately, it didn't make it out of COVID.
Mhm.
But in 2013, we founded what was 13th Dimension, and that was, we started it early. It had a whole bunch of different ideas, but we really had no plan. Even the name came up by accident.
Mhm.
It was I wanted to call it something real. I didn't want to do Parallel Worlds again. I also didn't want to do. I wanted something to say comics, and it was Cliff's eternally smart move that he says, no, we can't call it comics because what if we write about other things? So I'm like, all right, that makes sense. And he's like, oh, it should sound. He says, like a good website always like it sounds like something but says nothing at the same time. It can be whatever you want it to be. I'm like, that's brilliant. He says, but it should have sort of a retro-y, even though we weren't really even doing the retro thing,
Mhm.
because we want to have this kind of like a retro cool sounding name. And I'm like, what? You mean like Adventures in the 10th Dimension or something like that? He goes, yeah, like something something very 1950s ish like that. And I'm like, okay. And we hooked onto the Dimension name.
Mhm.
And the way we hit on 13 was simply we sat there both on the phone. By this time it was I think it was that night.
Mhm.
And we sat on the phone and we basically looked up to see and went from one and started counting upward and seeing what domains were available. So I said, well, we don't want to do first, second, or third dimension. That
Mhm.
doesn't work. Fourth dimension doesn't really work because it's already out there. Fifth dimension because of the musical group that won't work.
Mhm.
I kind of set on eighth dimension because maybe I was channeling Buckaroo Banzai, even though I wasn't a fan. And I liked that. But we went all the way through until finally at one point, I think during the conversation, I said to him, wait a minute. What about 13? 13 is a great number. That's like it's got its own thing. And he's like, okay. So I checked and it was available. And I'm like, what do you say? He's like, yeah, let's do it. And we bought it right there for like 25 bucks and 13th Dimension was born. So that's I think this is the first time the secret origin of the name 13th Dimension has come out. But here's the best part is because the internet being what it is, one
Mhm.
thing I did want to make sure is like that there wasn't like a store out there called 13th Dimension,
Right.
or there wasn't like some kind of weird sex act called
Right.
13th, because anything's possible
This
on
is
the
very
internet.
true.
Right. So I look up there, is there a meaning to 13th dimension? And let me, I'll tell you what, if you'll permit me, because I think you'll
Sure.
get a kick out of this. Because I wrote it down and I've kept it in my notes ever since. I found there is actually a definition of
Oh.
13th dimension. And it was something that I found on some new age site. And I'll read you what the description is. The 13th dimension is the gateway to the universes beyond our own universe. This is the level of cosmic consciousness, the cosmic logos, and the source of all other universes in the multiverse. It is through the 13th dimension that we are able to access other universes. Many see the 13th dimension as a new universe that humanity is ascending to, as mastery of the 13th dimension allows you to travel between universes. In
Wow.
other words, it's the gateway to the multiverse.
There you go.
Therefore it is another word for parallel worlds. So it was like, all right, that's I'm Jewish, and the word for destiny is Besher.
Yeah.
And we're like, okay, that's it. No more. We're done. We're done here. Let's not mess with it. So that's how 13th Dimension was born, and it became very quickly an obsession for me,
Mhm.
and I really I had so much to learn,
Right.
because I really, again, not only had I missed about 10 years of comics, but my again, the Batman thing, which comes through at the site almost on a daily basis, is still my that's central to everything I do. But I had so much to learn about the rest of comics, and so it was an education for me as we went along. And after 2 years, Cliff and I decided we were going to part ways, and the reason was basically he didn't really have any desire to be in publishing. I didn't really have any desire to promote shows. We both helped each other, and it was a very amicable decision.
Mm.
So on a handshake deal, he says it was, here's the site's yours.
Wow.
You can you can take it. And I'm like, great. And and so for the last 11 years or so, or 10 years, I've been operating it on my own
Mm.
and doing a lot of trial and error. And the goal at the beginning always was to have collaborators, to have people from inside the industry who could give their perspective on things. Because when I started, I was like, nobody knows who I am. Why would anybody care about anything I had to say about anything? And so it was always and then on the first, we had like a soft launch where we just, populated the site with
Mm.
some stories, but nobody knew about it because we didn't promote it. But the first day that we promoted it, I had somehow, and I don't even remember how, I had gotten Mark Wade to write some kind of introductory something, and that was like, okay. And there were a few people early on who were really, really encouraging
Mm.
and helpful, both online and behind the scenes. That really allowed this thing to kind of take on a life of its own. And then as the years developed, it became its own thing. And so it's an incredibly gratifying thing to be a part of and to do.
I mean, you have guys like Paul Kupperberg putting
Oh
stories in,
yeah.
and this, I mean, Paul is one of the greatest. Is there a name that has asked to be part of it that is a comic fan? You had to kind of not geek out and just be like, oh yeah, yeah, sure, of course.
Yes. I'm still kind of amazed when that happens. I'll get an email from somebody, hey Dan, I'd like to do this. Why, yes. Why, yes, that would be nice. A few people have been, or just as, which has also been well, has been, or just has been just as great, is when I do ask someone to do something,
Mhm.
just, throwing it out there and they say yes. And by that I mean there are some certain instances like getting Neil Adams to write an appreciation for Denny O'Neil. And we were the only site that he did that for when Denny had died. And I knew I was kind of poking the bear a little bit here because they were not on good terms.
Mhm.
It was I call them the Lennon and McCartney of DC because they were these two guys who were so great together, but there was bad blood and I was
Right.
aware of it, but I figured, he might have something to say here. And he said yes right off the bat. I was,
Wow.
that was when I really felt, I felt really honored
Mhm.
for that sort of thing. But yeah, the way all I mean, the Paul joined in it basically was a COVID hobby for him
Okay.
because a lot of times, and it was, I used to do this much more than I do now because now I have a cast of regulars, about 10 to
Mhm.
12 people who write for the site or do various things for the site all the time.
Right.
But I was always used when I was more like the chief cook and bottle washer,
Mhm.
doing everything. A lot of the way I would get content would be, through people wanting to promote something,
Mhm.
and they would contact me or their representatives would contact me and say, hey, listen, I'd like to do something at your site. I like what you do. How about if I do top 13 this? And what we'll do, and the exchange, because here's the thing, I call the website the only socialist comic book website in the world, not
Mhm.
because of personal politics or anything, but
Mhm.
because everybody gets paid exactly what I do,
Mhm.
which is to say nothing.
Right.
I actually, if you notice, there are no ads on 13th
Right.
Dimension. There's absolutely no, so there's no income whatsoever. And
Mhm.
I did that for a reason. So I operated at a loss.
Mhm.
But I'm okay with that because of what it costs in the big picture. It's just it's basically it's my hobby.
Mhm.
So the what it would be is like people would come to me, I'd like to do this, I'd like to do that, and in exchange, I would say, yeah, we'll promote your book, we'll promote this, we'll do whatever.
Mhm.
And that's how Paul and I got connected. But it was during 2020, and he got the bug, and he just had so many things he wanted to do. And the next thing I knew it, he was writing 2 to 3 columns a week for me, and I'm just like, this is fantastic. And I will say that that was a real turning point
Mhm.
for the site. There are a couple of turning points from the site. One of them was in 2016. Again, thanks to Neil Adams was a big part of that one. Also, 2016 was the 50th anniversary of Batman 66, and I really kind of ended up cornering the market on the news related to all of that, and also interviews with Adam West and Julie Newmar and all of that. So 2016 was a big year. 2020 was a big year because I had a lot of creators who had nothing else to do. You know,
Mhm.
the comic book industry had shut down, and so I kind of became this place where people would write because they just wanted to do stuff. So Paul, what was great about Paul is that he gave the site more of a credibility that I'd really had before because he was a professional. He'd been in the, he's a lifer.
Mhm.
He knows so much and is such a great storyteller and is funny and he has interesting points of view and he tells great insider stories that, you go back 5 years now and he's almost up to his 200th column, which he's already written, by the way. It'll be run the way we figure that at the rate he's going, it'll probably run in June. But yeah, and then when Paul came in, he was a regular, and
Mhm.
then the next thing you know, it just started to build from there.
Mhm.
And so now, I mean, we have days of the week that are. I have people like Kerry Canlin and Bill Morrison and Des Taylor and Franco from Art Baltazar and
Mhm.
Franco. Franco, nobody knows him as Franco Aureliani. They just know him as
No,
Franco.
just Franco. Yeah.
Just Franco. And most recently, Scott Shaw, who
Mhm.
was one of the founders of San Diego Comic Con
Mhm.
and has been doing a kind of a shtick, a column or presentation called Oddball Comics, which he's been doing since the 70s.
Mhm.
And he was looking for a home for it. So, it was actually Bill who said, "Hey, Scott Shaw wants to get in contact with you." And I'm like, "Yeah, bring it on." I need an S. I got Sundays covered. I need an S for Saturdays. And Scott Shaw Saturdays is perfect. So that's been, that's our most recent one. I just need to now figure someone who's got the name with it begins with a W and begins with a th, because
Wow.
Wednesday and Thursdays are the only days of the week that are not spoken for.
And what I love so much about it is like the articles and stuff, they're kind of deep cuts. Like it's not just, baseline like, oh, Superman that like it goes further into like some more of the obscure and like stuff that like real fans just sort of dig into like, oh yeah, 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 totally. Like I think that's what's so wonderful about it.
Well, thank you. That is, is really my intent from the beginning was to have creators involved. That's why if you look on the site, it says that our little tagline that we made up was, I think, I'm not looking at the site,
Mhm.
looking at you, but it's like creators, culture, comics, or some highfalutin sounding thing. But creators was always part of it. I
Mhm.
always wanted to get that point of view. And by doing so, what it's been is a real, as I mentioned earlier, a real education for me
Mhm.
because they brought a different perspective and made me understand how comic books work,
Mhm.
how who are the greats that most people don't necessarily like. I always knew who Alex Toth was,
Right.
but I didn't understand how influential he was until I started talking to artists specifically, and they would inevitably announce him or name him as one of their biggest influences. So it's like then that starts to spread and the site starts to spread. And by having so many contributors who have so many different perspectives and their own experiences and their own loves, they bring a lot of what I can't. And that's why it's incredibly gratifying to me to be able to do stuff like that because a lot of times I'm reading a column and I'm like you or anybody else, maybe not you, but like anybody else, I'm like I'm reading this for the first time or I'm
Mhm.
learning about this and I'm being introduced to something that is, man, that is great. And that's and so I appreciate that because that's really one of the big things. I love doing things that are offbeat and all, but when we do things like retro hot picks or even our
Mhm.
weekly hot picks and Bronze Age bonanza and some of these other things, plus what someone like Scott Shaw writes about. When we just this week we had one about Charlton Premiere #2 from 1967. In
Mhm.
a million years, I never would have had a reason to write about that until he brought it to the table, and I'm like, oh, this is hilarious. This is great. And you get someone like Bill Morrison, and Bill, who's got this lengthy career in animation, and in graphic design and as an artist. He did the Beatles' Yellow Submarine graphic novel,
Mhm.
and so he has this whole other point of view also. Plus the folks who are not really who the super fan types who are regulars, Walt Grogan, Jim Beard, Chris Franklin,
Mhm.
myself, who are just really hardcore, passionate fans who have an outlet. Bill writes books,
Yeah.
and he writes for the site. Chris writes articles, magazine articles for Tomorrow's publications, for Toy Ventures, and he writes for the site. And so
Mhm.
they all have these different perspectives and these different loves. And I'm basically just collating all of that. And I feel like sort of like the chairman of a club,
Right.
basically, and that also helped me kind of get my head around what I wanted to do, because at the beginning I was so resentful of the sites that were just content farms, and I
Mhm.
was like, they have all these I'm very competitive, so ridiculously so to some degree, where I'm like, why did Newsarama get that and why didn't I? Well, because I was tiny, you know, I because get over yourself. Um, but eventually I started to find a niche. I
Mhm.
started to play to what were my strengths and the strengths of the people and listening a lot to reader feedback and
Right.
reading the feedback, and both inside and outside the industry really started to turn the site into, and again, it was not the intent at the beginning, is a retro cool site. A friend of mine used that term for it. I'm not so arrogant as to call it that myself, but it is a retro site. The focus is nostalgia. There's new stuff in there, but usually how it plays
Right.
against what came before. That's why I cover facsimile editions, for
Mhm.
example, and treasury editions and stuff like that as a beat.
Right.
And I have really good relationships with the publishers now, so that we're able to break news routinely every month on what's going on the facsimile edition beat. What these new formats, particularly what DC is doing right now, which is amazing. Not only just bringing back the Treasury edition as part of the facsimile edition line, but actually now we just had the announcement this week, creating a new Treasury edition that
Right.
is like, and these giant size 11 by 17 comics. I
Mhm.
mean, all of that stuff is in the fans, the readers really, really respond. And I'm fortunate that in a world of publishing that is usually in decline
Mhm.
across the board, um, the number of unique visitors to the site and the amount of traffic that we get um, just keeps growing.
Right.
So we're at our it just keeps getting bigger,
Right.
and it's I ever think, well, will I ever make this into a money making venture? And I think maybe when I retire, but that's at
Right.
least if I get to at least another 10 years from now, so nobody has to worry about going through pop-up ads anytime soon. And the other problem with that is if I start making money, I got to share it.
There
It's
you
all
go.
like I said, I've made the commitment. I said I will pay everybody what I pay myself. So if I bring in $500, I got to find a way to split it 13 ways, and there you have it.
There you
So
have. One project I love to talk about is something that fans have been waiting for decades. Um, Came together this year via Kickstarter, and you are in this. We're talking about the DC Style Guide, and you have an interview with who I consider the GOAT, the greatest, the coolest, and I just dropped it. Jose
well,
Luis Garcia Lopez, the man himself. Talk a little bit how that came about and what it was like for you to talk to this legend in the industry.
I had met him before, actually at a comic show, and had dinner with him just
Okay.
because we were sitting at the same table. It's not like, hey, it was this. It was at one of Cliff's shows,
Mhm.
and Jose and I don't think he even remembers this. This was early on, and
Mhm.
he was, and we just sat one evening and just chatted, and he was wonderful. Just really, really, just sweet, sweet natured guy. If he's aware of the impact that he's had, he doesn't show it. It's really quite striking, because you do meet people in this industry, and boy, they'll tell you how big they are. He's not one of them. So with the book, the that came about. It's funny because you said, the time when you're thinking like, okay, when someone comes to you to do something. And I had been in touch with it was one of our contributors had tipped me off late one night because I had been beating the drum for this.
Mm.
And and I'm not the only one by any stretch, but was beating the drum for this and to be released, and somebody had seen something online that that there was this ad in it. I think it was Doc Shaner had posted something on Instagram that showed that there was an ad in the comic that was a comp that said that this was coming, and I went bananas. And so I immediately wrote it up off of that late at night, jumped on it, did enormous traffic. I mean, as you
Mm.
might imagine, it turned out, to be one of the biggest days in the site's history.
Mm.
And I got in contact with the guys who were doing this, the folks at Standards Manual right away. I'm like, I can't do too much on this. And long story short, um, I'm sitting. This was last May,
Mm.
and I'm at the Rolling Stones show in at the Meadowlands with my son, and it's already just having a great time, waiting for the show to start. And I check my email, and in there is, hey, would you like to interview Jose Luis Garcia for the book? Because I had been doing by that time already some um, uh, consulting on the book.
Okay.
I was giving, because the guys who were doing this, I don't, they were really passionate about doing it, but this was their first time in the world of comics.
Right.
So I was sort of their guide a little bit about, okay, this is what, X, Y, and Z. So I was involved already. And then they offered me this opportunity. And
Mm.
I'm sitting there, I'm like, this is like one of the greatest nights of my life. I'm sitting here about to watch the Rolling Stones, who killed that night, by the way,
Yeah.
with my son, who's an adult, and I'm getting, and the opportunity offered to me to interview him for the style guide. And I'm like, this is this is amazing. DC was great about it, the whole everything. So yeah, and also Mary Edlin, who I interviewed her as well. She was
Mm.
involved in the creation of the book.
Mm.
Um, and I had also Paul Levitz, who
Mm.
wrote the introduction. I actually introduced him to the publishers,
Right.
and so it was one of these things like was when you asked me earlier, like was there something that where they came to you and you were like, it was this, and it was I'm incredibly honored. I, I hope I don't sound arrogant. I hope I don't
Mm.
sound self-aggrandizing because I don't mean to. I'm just really excited about the fact that I got to do this,
Right.
and it has been a marvelous experience, and every step of the way with the book, we promoted it at the site, and I did stories about this is what it looks like inside it. This is it, literally the video of it at the printer. I
Right.
mean, it was really, really getting into it. So it was absolutely one of the best experiences I've ever had in publishing. I've ever
Mm.
had, certainly related to the site. Um, and I just am glad that I got to be a part of it. Really, it's just the fact that I'm a part of it. That's more than enough to me. And to see it on the shelf,
Mm.
and there's my name on the cover, like there's that little overwrap that and there it is, and it's just like you know I didn't plan for this, but I'll take it.
And it's so well put together, and
Yeah, they
it's
did a great job.
it's for guys like us. It's a dream to see this
Yeah,
art. I mean, for me,
yeah,
I love the superpowers line of toys, and the
yeah.
fact that that's in there, and I'm like, oh my
Mhm.
goodness gracious, like it's just the coolest.
Well, even before while they were just getting started, because as it turned out, they did not expect
Mhm.
the response that it got, and when they saw, and they realized what was happening, originally they were going to move they're going to move the publication date up because they
Mhm.
were like, we got to get pre-orders online. We really got to get moving on this.
Mhm.
And then it ended up, because of that, it ended up being delayed a little bit. But the
Mhm.
whole thing from announcement to publication was only 6 months, which is in publication time is no time at all.
Right.
And the fact that it came out as great as it did is really a testament to, because they're graphic designers, so they knew what they were doing. What they
Mhm.
needed for me was the guidance of, okay, here's what's important, here's this is what, blah 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 blah. So it is really great. But one of the cool things, because they're based in Brooklyn,
Mhm.
was I took a day off from work and I went over to their studio and just basically went over the two originals with them and
Oh.
looked through it and just like made notes and gave them some feedback. And I'm like, this is something you might want to consider. This is, whatever. Because that's also the beauty of the fact that I don't make any money on
Mhm.
the site, is that it's not I don't need to necessarily, and I'm very open about this also,
Mhm.
is I don't necessarily have to keep the same journalistic distance from doing something.
Mhm.
Being a part of the book, it was like all of this is for fun and love.
Right.
So if I have an opportunity to get in with something, I'm going to take it. And if if I could help in any little way that I can for something like that, to get it to people like me, because people say, I mean, how do I choose my stories or whatever? It's like, well, I write what I like, or I publish things that I like,
Mhm.
or I publish things that I know people like me like, even if I may not like it myself. But that's
Right.
it. I mean, I'm like, it's a, that's really how it works.
Mhm.
And for good and for bad, I'll say that for sure. So that's great. And then there's another one where, coming out in June, I think it is
Mhm.
Two Morrows is doing a book on Marshall Rogers,
Mhm.
which is a long awaited, long overdue illustrated biography of one of the all-time greats, who unfortunately I think is getting forgotten.
Mhm.
And I think for a number of reasons, and it's unfortunate. But I'm really glad that he's doing this. And they had contacted me, and I have a very good relationship with John Morrow, the
Mhm.
publisher there. We do a lot of stuff on their publications at the site. And I had done an interview with Steve Englehart also during COVID.
Mhm.
Um, he and I originally, Steve and I had built a relationship, and um, it was what was going to be East Coast Comic Con for 2020. Steve, who doesn't do many shows, lives in California, and he was going to come east and do Cliff's show in New Jersey.
Mhm.
And I immediately when Cliff said that he landed him, I contacted Steve. I said, "Listen, you want to do a panel?"
Mhm.
And he goes, "Absolutely." So we were already planning on a panel, and then the show got canceled because of COVID. So I said, "This seems like a terrible opportunity to waste."
Mhm.
And I said, how about this? Why don't we do a Zoom call, and we will go issue by issue of your run with Marshall Rogers on Detective Comics. We'll do.
Mhm.
And I said, what do you think? He says, yeah. He says, I've been interviewed about that a million times, but never like this. So we spent over 2 nights, 3 hours online, talking, sometimes panel by panel. And I would ask him, like, who came, was this you or was this Marshall? Or what
Mhm.
was this? Or what was the this and the other thing? And how much, because what a lot of people don't realize is that the scripts were done.
Right.
It wasn't like they were sitting in a studio or having any kind of collaboration.
Mhm.
When everything was finished, when he saw the art, the pages, his response was, "Oh, thank God," because he didn't know Marshall really from Adam. At the time that this kicked off. I mean, obviously they became collaborators,
Mhm.
but at the start, he was as surprised as anybody by how great it looked.
Mhm.
So we went through all of that, and then they asked me if I wanted to, if they could use that interview, that whole section, because it turned into like a 10 or 11 part series that we did,
Mhm.
to use it in the Marshall Rogers book. And of course, they said yes,
Right.
absolutely. Give me a copy of the book, fine
Yeah.
by me. And that was the quickest deal under the sun. And so we just this weekend posted a big 40-page a preview of the book.
Mhm.
And that part of the interview, that entire interview is in the book. It's chapter 7 of the book.
Right.
So, I mean, Marshall Rogers is someone, after Neil Adams.
Mhm.
Uh, Adams was the first person whose art I whose comics I would collect simply because he was in them or
Mhm.
on them. and Rogers was the second, particularly with Batman. So I've been a fan of his since I was about 10 years old, and never he is someone I never got to meet because he died before I was really doing this. But he would have been one of the first people I wanted to interview.
There's something you mentioned just now, and it's such an important thing is it's sort of preserving history to make sure
Mhm.
these names aren't forgotten. What you guys do on the site and stuff like that, by talking about these comics and the creators and stuff like that, it keeps them alive and it keeps them in folks' memory because I think there's generations coming who might not know these people. I think it's so important what you guys are doing, and
Thank
what
you.
Tomorrow's does as well to keep these names alive and to really recognize the contributions they made because there was so much hard work they did to put into these comics that we enjoy so much.
Thank you. I never really understood the responsibility of that until until the site started to kick in. And I would hear from one of the most moving things is I'll write a piece about someone who, and I'm not going to name names because,
Mhm,
but like certain people who I consider a big deal.
mhm,
And the world at large may not know who they are, but because comics, it is still this very kind of niche.
mhm.
The superheroes have taken over the world, but comics still have not.
Exactly.
And I mean to some degree, I mean it's certainly bigger than people realize because of course all of the young adult stuff and
Mhm,
manga and all it's an enormous industry. Don't get me wrong, but still in terms of when you're talking about these earlier generations, a lot of these are not known. These are not people who are known to the average person on the street. And I started getting messages from family members when I would write something about, these are my 13 favorite whatever by so and so, and I'd get a note from their daughter or their grandchild and saying, "Thank you so much." And I'd be like, I'm, I'm just, I'm just doing a thing, I'm just doing, I'm being a fan here. But and then when you realize that, and it adds away, and then I started from creators from that era also I would hear and say, "Thank you for keeping the work alive. Thank you for." Somebody once said, "Thank you for making sure that people remember my friends."
mhm,
And when you realize that, it's like, okay, again, I'm not so arrogant as to say I have a responsibility, but I'm aware
mhm,
of what the site can mean to some people. And I got to tell you, Oren, it's not something I ever expected.
mhm.
I didn't plan for it to go this way. I just wanted to write about comics, but it is. I'm deeply flattered that it's had that kind of effect on some people. I mean, it just it really it means a lot to me.
I wanted before we wrap up, just talk a little Batman for a second. I want to get your
Yeah, wrap
because
up. You want to talk about Batman when we wrap up? We should have started with Batman. The whole thing would have been about Batman.
well, I want to get your thoughts because you talk about how much the show meant to you, and you hear a lot of folks saying that the kids who then read the comics, it was sort of a different vibe as
Oh
from the
yeah,
show, a little grittier and
sure.
stuff like that.
Yeah.
As Batman started to get progressively darker, did that affect you as a reader, or did you kind of just roll with this is just the way things are going?
No, 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 no. In fact, it was there was sort of for not everybody, like Jim
Mhm.
Beard I mentioned earlier because of his book, and Jim is now a writer at the
Right.
site, and he didn't know that he had helped to inspire
Mhm.
13th Dimension. I'd written it in a piece. I was like, by the way, Jim was one of the inspirations for this site, and he had no idea. He's like, really? I'm like, yeah. I'm like, dude, in fact when I first started it, I wanted to have him as a regular right off the bat, and at first
Yeah.
he was like, I don't think I can. I don't think I could make the time necessarily. And of course, nobody knew that. Again, I just some schmuck with a website. And then eventually it became a thing, and
Mhm.
so. But anyway, I digress. Um, I used to ask Batman fans, particularly I would do theme weeks with Batman '66. I've done a
Mhm.
lot of them, and I would ask people, did you ever have a falling out with the show? Was there ever a point where you just kind of rejected it? And
Mhm.
I asked that question because that was me.
Mhm.
By the time the '80s rolled around, and I as a comic book fan, and going to, the places I would get comics, um, Batman was still a joke, even though Batman was really good. You had Len Wein writing him, Irv Novick art, and they had just come off of Englehart and Rogers, and
Mhm.
really good quality stuff. Jerry Conway had taken over the book also, and he'd written some great stuff. But Batman was still considered kid stuff. I
Mhm.
mean, everybody I was talking to, with the older kids, for example, they're all talking about Frank Miller and Daredevil. They're talking about Moon Knight. And Moon Knight is Batman done right. They were talking about these other, and it was so. I began to become embarrassed, not for my Batman fandom,
Mhm.
but because I felt like there was this burden that you carried along with it, and it was because of the shadow of the show, and that everybody assumed that because you read Batman, it was kid stuff,
Mhm.
and it was like, ah. So by the time Dark Knight Returns came out,
Mhm.
I embraced it. I'm like, oh, finally, something's, this is what Batman really is,
Right.
taken to its logical, extreme in terms of what was going on in the comics.
Mhm.
Batman Year One on top of that, great, loved it, absolutely, obsessed with it, all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
And then, but what started to happen, and I, by the time Batman 1980, the movie came
Right.
out, the '89 movie, I was all in on the grim and gritty. What shifted back though for me is the fact that those stories were so great
Mhm.
and had such an impact that in the intervening years, intervening decades now, most writers who write Batman now, or many of them, everybody's trying to do their own Dark Knight. Everybody's trying to emulate the same thing. And I think that they've taken so much of the personality out of Batman now that I myself don't read. And this is no knock on any particular creator or creators. This is just something that I think is endemic to the character right now.
Mhm.
Is that I read current Batman, but I read mostly mini series and finite. So I don't read many ongoing series, period.
Right.
But I'm very picky. I love all versions of Batman,
Mhm.
but when it comes down to it, the ideal for me is the Bronze Age, which captures both. You've got some of the lighthearted stuff and some of the serious stuff, and it doesn't veer too far in either direction for the most part.
Mhm.
So yeah, no, I mean, I love the Pattinson movie, The Batman.
Right.
Absolutely loved it. Loved the Penguin TV show. It was great.
Mhm.
I'm reading the mini series Batman Dark Patterns, which is really dark,
Mhm.
is fabulous. At the same time, every night for 20 minutes, probably 25 minutes, I put the Batman TV show on in the background as I'm getting ready for bed because it just makes me feel good. So I'm very big tent where Batman is concerned.
Nightfall. Thoughts on that?
Nightfall happened while I was on my great hiatus.
Gotcha.
So I read it. I did read it.
Mhm.
I went back and to see what I had missed. Um, Conceptually great.
Mhm.
Execution, not as, just because it was so many stories and
Right.
so many crossovers and so many issues. And this was actually that whole thing, because by 92,
Mhm.
Batman was in everything.
Right.
He was a guest star in everything. And I had this obsessive, I still do to a
Mhm.
large degree, an obsessive compulsive quality that I
Mhm.
felt like if he showed up somewhere, I had to either get it or read it or whatever. And it was the point of diminishing returns. So I wasn't getting it much. I was like chasing the dragon. I was like, the feeling that I would get from reading comics when I was earlier was disappearing, and I was just reading them for the sake of reading them.
Right.
Now it's I am if I'm not liking something, I just put it aside.
Yep.
But I love what Mark Waid is doing with World's Finest, for example. And I'm reading the last Halloween, and I'm reading the new Hush more out of curiosity than anything else.
Mhm.
Um, but so I'm not sure. I think I've forgotten your original question, but because I just ramble when it comes to Batman. I don't know. Did I answer it,
Yeah,
or
no, just that
is
that that you roll the punches when it comes to him becoming
Oh
sort
yeah,
of a
yeah, yeah,
darker character.
yeah.
Yep.
With Nightfall, I thought it was fun. The idea of it was great, but I just think it was. I mean, there's so much. I mean, how many trade paperbacks are like four of them or five of them that you have to read the whole story, and
Right.
that to me is that's just not what I really want to do.
And we're back. Such a cool dude, man. Such a cool dude. I love 13th Dimension. Uh, when I go on, Facebook and stuff like that, and I see their posts, Paul Kupperberg does a lot of writing for them. You have other guys doing there as well too, and you have these lists of, different comics, different characters, different stories that, it's things that I didn't know beforehand. So it's a great source of information, and Dan does a phenomenal job with it. And we're so pleased to have been able to talk with him. Love to have him back on again to talk some more. So I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and we'll see you soon. Bye.